In part 1, we explored what geopolitics, and especially its imperialist branches are, and what terminology it deploys. In part 2, we reviewed what Russia's big plan is and their motivations behind it. As we have learned previously, Dugin is envisioning of building an empire of empires, with the Russians dominating the top-level empire. We will now move digging deeper to uncover how these region-specific sub-empires are to be built and what country-specific plans are needed to dispose of the pesky smaller nations. We will start by looking at the direction that Dugin argues is the most important one and in which Russia has already initiated active and visible actions: the West. We will be taking a closer look at what he said in his book about Ukraine in 1997 and assessing if we can find also other parallels with Russia's and others' behavior before and since Crimea occupation. So, the situation in the West, as Dugin sees it, is that since World War II and Cold War, USA is militarily occupying countries and forcing them at gunpoint into committing the mortal sins of mutually beneficial trading. What's even more annoying to Dugin than the foothold that USA has in Europe is that the countries are not perceiving this as a burden or an inconvenience, and there's little proactive pressure to seek cutting ties with US that Russia could leverage. West Europe has two nuclear powers, UK and France, and in addition to their displeasingly potent military, they are not likely to accept being led by Russians, which in Dugin's mind means that they need to be treated as enemies. Another pain point that he considers to be a relic of earlier wars is the chain of independent countries that he refers to as a sanitary cordon between Germany and Russia, which in Dugin's mind is just begging to be assimilated into political units of greater importance. He sees that geopolitical expansionist passivity and low importance of investing into military capabilities is a sign of West European countries' weakness, but he acknowledges that as a military alliance, they still do pose a challenge. Dugin acknowledges that there is so much skepticism against Russia's geopolitical initiatives in Europe that Russia cannot hope to gain sympathy to its cause by driving it openly. To avoid the need to spend its physical force immediately from the first meter beyond its border, it needs a facade to express and advance its plans. Ultimately, though, the specific plan in the West is to reach and control maritime borders. And no, he is not talking about the Baltic Sea. To loosen USA's grip on West Europe, Dugin envisions that Russia should be active in feeding and catalyzing anti-US tendencies. Central Europe alone does not have sufficient political and military potential to gain true independence from US Atlantic control. Moreover, in the current condition, it is difficult to expect from Europe a genuine geopolitical and national awakening without the revolutionary influence of the Russian factor. It is noteworthy that Dugin is not even entertaining the possibility for Russia to make itself more appealing as a partner to collaborate with. He's simply trying to make the choice between the lesser evils slightly more favorable towards Russia's cause. And in a theme that continues throughout the book, he's assuming that the only thing that prevents other nations from proactively throwing USA out of Eurasia is the lack of military strength, which Russia would be happy to provide, monopolize, and eventually use against its allies in Eurasia. He is right in assessing that sparking ill will against USA is hard, and it would be an even harder sell if it became clear that increasing distance to USA accounts simultaneously reducing the distance to Russia. He aims to build a smokescreen to blur this by having an ally with a better reputation to serve as Russia's puppet. Eurasian factor in West Europe cannot be directly the line of Moscow. Moscow speaks here only through Berlin. In yet another theme that will repeat itself in other geographical directions, Dugin singles out geopolitical adversaries, that is, countries who have their own geopolitical aspirations and the means to act upon them. In West Europe, this means UK and France. Dugin considers UK to be a lost cause, too deep in the Atlantic's pocket to be salvageable and convertible into a puppet. Dugin proposed various methods to destabilize UK and diminish its ability to drive policies that are not aligned with Russia's. In the Eurasian project, England will inevitably become a scapegoat, since the Eurasian process of continental integration will necessarily take place not only without taking into account English interests, but even in the direct contrast to these interests. In this context, a considerable role should be played by European and, more broadly, Eurasian support for Irish, Scottish and Welsh nationalism up to and including the promotion of separatist tendencies and with the political destabilization of Great Britain. While it would be too generous to view Brexit, Scots' push for independence and deepening political divide between major political parties solely to the influence of Russia, the parallels to Dugin's book are too numerous to overlook completely. When it comes to France, Dugin is entertaining the possibility that France could be swayed into supporting Eurasian agenda instead of Atlantist orientation, but he is leaning towards expecting France to be an adversary rather than a puppet that Russia could play. Throughout the book, he is notably imprecise when it becomes specifying the game plan towards France. Later, when discussing other geopolitical adversaries, Turkey and China, he remembers to list France along them and keeps reminding that eventually France's territory needs to be controlled. The territory of France is a necessary component of the Eurasian bloc in the West, since control over the Atlantic coast directly depends on this, and accordingly the security of the new empire on the western frontiers. He does not specifically say that Germany should conquer France, but instead he speaks of creating a Franco-German union and a European integration inspired by deep geopolitical impulse from Russia. But given how conscious French are on their national identity, it would be naive to assume that they would allow anyone to come and seize control of the Atlantic coast via paper-based agreements. And this time, France would not be dependent on a bypassable fortification line. This time, they would be protecting themselves with nukes, if need be. But I'm sure this is all just fine for Dugin. The weaker everyone else makes themselves by fighting with one another, the easier it will be for Russia to dispose of them later. Dugin proceeds to argue why Germany is the most natural ally in Europe instead of, say, France or United Kingdom. He doesn't even consider the possibility that there could be more than one ally per direction for the obvious reason that he wants to ensure that the allies remain sufficiently weak and vulnerable for further backstabbing. Firstly, he speaks highly of Germany and what it can bring to the table. Only Germany and the German people possess all the necessary qualities for the effective integration of this geopolitical region with a historical will, a well-developed economy, a privileged geographical position, ethnic homogeneity, and the consciousness of their civilizational mission. Terrestrial and ideocratic Germany has traditionally opposed merchant marine England. However, these necessary qualities he lists omit the most important ones: Germany's current military weakness and the reliance on imported resources. These Dugin sees as poison pills that enable Russia to keep Germany and the rest of the Europe more dependent on Russia than Russia is on them. Only Russia will be able to provide Europe with strategic and political independence and resource autarky. Therefore, the European empire should be formed precisely around Berlin, which is on a direct and vital axis with Moscow. That is, Russia is offering independence that is based on being held hostage by their continuous supply of resources and goodwill of not turning their weapons against Germany. At first, it might seem odd that Dugin is proposing to team up with the country responsible for the most recent serious attack on Russian territory that ended up creating lots of historical baggage that Russia keeps reminding to their citizens on an annual basis. But in an impressive demonstration of mental acrobatics, Dugin finds a way around this hurdle by claiming that it was Atlantists all along. Past history of Russia-German wars, which were the result of successful subversive activities of the Atlantic lobby in Germany and Russia, and not an expression of the political will of our continental peoples. Crafty people, those Atlantists, very clever and capable of them to lift extreme political parties into power in two major countries and making them weaken themselves by fighting with one another. perhaps they really are better at this geopolitics game. Dugin's not proposing to leave Germany free to work on their lot, as they might start getting funny ideas that are not compatible with Russia's interests. He wants to make sure that Russia has ultimate dominance in all things Germany would be doing, be it in Europe or beyond. Central European unification around Germany will have a positive meaning only if one fundamental condition is observed for the creation of a solid geopolitical and strategic Moscow-Berlin axis. The European empire without Moscow, and more broadly Eurasia, is not only unable to fully organize its strategic space with a shortage of military power, political initiative, and natural resources, but also in a civilizational sense does not have a clear ideals or guidelines, since the influence of the trade system and the market liberal values deeply paralyzed the foundations of the national worldview of the European peoples, undermined their historical organic value system. The European empire will become a full-fledged geopolitical and civilizational reality only under the influence of a new ideological, political, and spiritual energy from the depths of the continent, i.e., from Russia. The Eurasian impulse should come exclusively from Moscow, transmitting the civilizational mission with appropriate adaptation to European specifics of Russians to Berlin, and that in turn will begin European integration of the principles and projects inspired by the deep geopolitical continental impulse. It is necessary to ensure that it is geopolitics and its laws that become the main basis for the adoption of all significant foreign policy decisions in both Germany and Russia. That is, Germany should do Russia's bidding and heavy lifting, act as its facade, deny any collaboration or trade with the biggest economy and market in the world, allow itself to become hostage to Russia's resource supply, withhold from building its own military capability, and in return be complacent in the role of Russia's female canine. As outlandish as that might sound at first, Russia has been surprisingly successful in domesticating post-World War II Germany. Now that the coastal regions and foreign policy beyond Europe are dealt with, it's time to deal with the pesky smaller continental nations. For this, Dugin flips out the imperialists' favorite tactic, dividing other countries between themselves into spheres of influence. For Dugin, these countries are simply not isolated pickings, but instead tools that the arch-enemy, USA, has assembled into a barrier or a sanitary cordon that is built simply to prevent Russia and Germany from joining forces. The fact that these countries or cultures existed long before Zhang He or Columbus does not sway Dugin's reasoning. He cannot but see these countries as artificial and harmful creations of the Atlantists, which needs to be dealt as such. He argues that these countries are not real or have any independent initiative, but instead are only artificial constructions created by the Atlantists. Their mere existence is an unnatural abomination. A sanitary cordon is a territory of states and peoples located between two large geopolitical entities, whose union or mutual entry into the great space could constitute a dangerous competition for the interested state, formerly England, today United States. Sanitary cordon, created from small, embittered, historically irresponsible peoples and states with many claims and servile dependence on a thalassocratic West, consisting of states that cannot enter Europe as a full-fledged component, but are strongly repelled by Moscow and Eurasia. The policy of the sanitary cordon can be expressed in the formula independence from the neighbor and dependence on the far. At the same time, one must clearly understand that there can be no talk of any genuine independence or sovereignty. The countries of the near abroad that got away from the control of Moscow by the will of various geopolitical circumstances, among which their internal struggle for independence played a negligible role, if any. The parallels of the book that was published in 1997 and the rhetoric Russia used to attack the non-state of Ukraine are overwhelming. After the outburst of contempt towards these countries, Dugin proceeds to argue why these countries cannot be allowed to exist or form any alliances of their own. The most radical version of the sanitary cordon is the situation in which the intermediate country strives for complete independence from their both continental neighbors. Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Poland, including Western Prussia, Belarus, the Catholic anti-Eurasian minorities lobbying for this idea, Ukraine, especially the West Uniate Church, Hungary, Romania, also influenced by the Uniates, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. These entities themselves, if we consider them as state entities, are untenable, ethnically and religiously contradictory, strategically and economically underdeveloped, and devoid of resources. In other words, these fictitious states make sense only as strategic zones artificially supported by Atlanticism. CIS countries have a sufficient degree of autonomy and are de jure considered independent political entities. With regard to these countries, one can affirm, and with even greater reason, the same as with respect to the Russian Federation. These entities do not have any serious signs of true statehood, are devoid of attributes of actual sovereignty, and are more of a territorial process than stable and certain geopolitical units. Poland, Romania, Serbia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Baltic states in western Ukraine, etc. The current NATO strategists are pursuing the same line, putting forward the idea of creating a Black Sea-Baltic federation of states that would be directly related to Atlanticism and potentially hostile to both Russia and Germany. These countries will be completely deprived of political independence, and the security of their people will be constantly threatened by continental neighbors who will not fail to take revenge. Make note especially these last quotes barely contained outburst of aggression. This is the first example, with many more to come, where Dugin advocates that Russia should seek to deploy more than the minimum amount of violence and destruction when conquering the empire. He seems to be having a long laundry list of sins that he sees other countries have committed against Russia, which demand revenge and retribution. That eerily sounds like ethnic and cultural cleansing once Russia gets to have its way in running the matters in these lands. As we will see, the most damning sins in his mind demanding the most severe punishments are breaking free of the USSR, the Baltics, Ukraine, and so on, breaking free of the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Czech, and so on, resisting successfully Russia's annexation attempts, Finland, competing against Russia for the leading role in Eurasia, China, Turkey, France, and former allies once they have outlived their usefulness. So, after having dismissed all the alternatives for the states and people, he arrives at the chosen conclusion: the unavoidable necessity of dividing and conquering them in collaboration with Germany. The task of Eurasia is that the cordon does not exist. Only the absence of a sanitary cordon can make these pan-Eurasian relations normal, turn the space from Dublin to Vladivostok into a zone of Eurasian cooperation and strategic partnership. The main thing to strive for is the categorical elimination of any semblance of a sanitary cordon, the deliberate dispelling of the illusions of the intermediate states regarding their potential independence from geopolitically powerful neighbors. New borders are inevitable. Some regions should be divided again. The USSR was like a bar of chocolate with the boundaries of the lobe republics marked. After the slices are broken off, it is no longer enough to put them together to restore the entire tile. From now on, it can only be achieved by remelting the entire tile as stamping again, which is a fancy way of saying ethnic cleansing. The only way to eliminate the sanitary cordon is to completely redistribute state neoplasm based on purely geopolitical factors. This does not have to automatically mean the annexation of territories to other states. It may be about creating in place of the states or federations or several states whose geopolitical orientation will, however, be unambiguous. The last quote is almost hilarious. Russia is definitely planning to annex its lot, but would very much prefer that Germany would prefer not to attach its dominion firmly to itself, as it would be later making it easier for Russia to change the terms of the deal. Dugin explicitly articulates how Germany and Russia should proceed to eradicate these countries. First, they must agree that no independent country can exist in Europe between Russia and Germany. Agree that independent countries between Russia and Germany cannot be allowed to create alliances between themselves or with third parties, especially USA. Agree to jointly suppress all conflicting initiatives, be they external, US-backed, local, or independent, that are not in line with this bilateral distribution. Agree that each country can assimilate the territories that are ethnically and religiously closer to one than the other. Agree beforehand who gets what. Agree not to interfere when the other proceeds to claim what's rightfully theirs. With the knowledge of how the previous attempts of splitting the lesser countries turned out, it might appear unfeasible that Germany would ever accept this kind of a proposal again. But then again, if this kind of a completely hypothetical secret deal had been agreed between Germany and Russia, what would be the behavior that we should expect to see from one party to the completely hypothetical situation in which the other party would start making advances to assimilate their share of the pie? But luckily, all this is just purely hypothetical dystopian horror scenario, and nothing like this can ever happen in reality in today's Europe. Countries in the hypothetical sanitary cordon would be paranoid to seek diversifying or boosting their defense architecture beyond relying on their immediate big neighbors, because no one will ever again stab them in the back. As Dugin lays out the plans for running Europe with Germany, he keeps dropping seemingly benign concessions and mutually beneficial arrangements Russia could be making in order to build good relations with Germany. But if one spends more than a few moments looking at these compromises, concessions, and gestures of goodwill, it becomes apparently clear just how toxic they are in reality. Firstly, he proposes that Germany is made to be dependent on Russia, and Russia should reduce its dependence on Germany by stealing the basis of Germany's industrial power. Secondly, Russia graciously volunteers to be the sole provider of continental military capability so that no one else needs to burden themselves with such vulgarities. The Moscow-Berlin axis will help solve a whole range of the most important problems that both Russia and Germany face today. Russia, in such an alliance, receives direct access to high technology, to powerful investments in industry, and acquires guaranteed European complicity in the economic expansion of Russian lands. At the same time, there will never be economic dependence on Germany, since Germany will participate in Russia not as a charitable party, but as an equal partner, receiving strategic cover in return from Moscow, guaranteeing Germany political liberation from US domination and resource independence from the energy reserves of the Third World controlled by Atlanticism. The energy blackmail of Europe by the USA is based on this. Germany today is an economic giant and a political dwarf. Russia, on the contrary, is a political giant and an economic cripple. Thirdly, he proposes awarding Kaliningrad or Königsberg back to Germany, but without letting go of the military bases in there, as well as control of the Baltic countries in exchange of other land trades and military bases elsewhere, especially in the sanitary cordon countries Germany would be annexing. It is clear that Dugin is counting on the fact that when push comes to shove, these coastal strip regions will have their backs against the Baltic Sea, and Germany will not be able to protect these areas when Russia comes to claim them. In this perspective, it is advisable to return the Kaliningrad region, eastern Prussia, to Germany in order to abandon the last territorial symbol of the terrible fratricidal war. In order for this action not to be perceived by the Russians as another step in geopolitical surrender, it makes sense for Europe to offer Russia other territorial annexations or other forms of expanding the strategic zone of influence, especially from among the states who stubbornly seek to enter Black Sea-Baltic Federation. Fourthly, Dugin acknowledges that some areas in Europe can never be painlessly assimilated into Russia without leaving a seed of rebellion and separatism. These areas he graciously proposes to be awarded into Germany's sphere of influence. However, he still seeks to milk out the bargain maximally by trying to squeeze out a few more concessions and backstab options out of it. Refusing direct political domination over some territories in return, Moscow should receive the right to strategic presence on the westernmost borders of the entire Central European region. Finally, he wants to lull Germany into letting its guard down and to assuming that there is no need to invest in military capability or defensive structures that could be a nuisance when Russia eventually comes and changes the terms of the deal unilaterally. Bismarck's words, "Germany has no enemy in the East," should once again become the dominant German political doctrine, and the reverse maxim should be accepted by the Russian rulers on the western borders, Central Europe. Russia has only friends. These proposals may sound naive at first, like even a 5-year-old would see through these traps in an instant. Still, Russia has been astonishingly successful with these policies in the past. Ultimately, the goal for Russia will be to extend its rule from Vladivostok to Dublin. No political entity in between, no matter how compliant or sympathetic to Russia's rule, will be left standing. All will be assimilated. That is, if no one stops them. In the West, Russia should have maritime borders. This is a strategic imperative of the geopolitical development of Eurasia. Let us then move on to covering some region and country-specific plans Dugin is laying out as they provide further details and insights into Dugin's line of thinking. I will not be covering all mentioned countries individually and in detail, as most of them just keep repeating the same pattern. Either Germany assimilates them or Russia does. However, I want to single out selected region-specific highlights: Russia, Belarus, Finland, and Ukraine, as they have something unique to offer to the story. The only ideological barriers that Dugin hesitates to cross are the religious ones that date back to the Roman Empire. In no part of the book does he show any worry that people who are used to the liberal or democratic ideologies might have difficulties in accepting autocratic or kleptocratic ideologies. It's only the religious ideologies that he sees as potential source of trouble if not treated correctly. He fears that forcing different religions, even if they are just different branches of Christianity, to the same empire would build a pressure of separatism, or, what's even worse, could dilute Russia's cultural purity. As for Protestants or other branches of Christianity, he does not see any reason to treat them as an ideological entity, as long as they are kept separate from contaminating the ideological purity of Russian Orthodoxy. So, even other Slavic people should not be allowed to mix the waters of Russian Empire if they are not Orthodox. To avoid this clash of religions, he is proposing to recreate Prussia under the control of Germany to assimilate or control all Catholic countries of Northern Europe. But on Prussia, the process of strategic unification of the Baltic states into the single bloc begins. This bloc includes Norway, Sweden, Germany, Estonia, Finland, Karelia, Denmark, possibly Holland. Special status is delegated to Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Dugin seems to be getting confused even himself, as in another chapter he will be awarding Finland, Karelia to another Russian entity. But let's come back to this in just a moment's time. Slavic Catholics from Poland throughout western Belarus and western Ukraine, Volyn, Galicia, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic to Croatia and Slovakia in the west of the Balkan Peninsula, Hungary, Austria, and Bavaria. From a geopolitical point of view, all these people belong to Central Europe and should be structured around the Central European Center, which Germany naturally is. A direct impact of these areas of Moscow can never become a priority, since ethnic closeness only emphasizes cultural, historical, and spiritual religious differences. Belarus provides us with an example of what happens if you are as compliant and cooperative as Russia wants you to be. No amount of compliance will be enough to secure a long-lasting coexistence with Russia. Dugin considers Belarus as a non-state, ripe for the inevitable finalization of its annexation. Moscow should integrate with Belarus in the closest way, while not forgetting that the promotion of the cultural and linguistic identity of Belarusians is an important positive moment for the whole system of Eurasian integration. Belarus should be considered as a part of Russia, and therefore integration with it should be carried out. This is also a good reminder of where Ukraine would have headed if they had tried to continue appeasing Russia by selecting pro-Russian leaders. Furthermore, other countries advocating pro-Russian policies should have a close look at Belarus and think if this is really the path that they want for their countries. Dugin seems to be very annoyed and troubled when it comes to Finland. He seems to be acknowledging that the cultural value base in Finland is incompatible with what Russia would be offering, so he knows that Russia should not expect much sympathy or popular support to annexation attempts. He does not mention it explicitly, but he remembers what happened the last time when they attempted an unpopular annexation. Last time, we were a newly formed, immature country with rather undefined national identity. This time, we are a developed and stable democracy with values and identities that have a stark and a well-articulated contrast to the ones that Russians would be bringing with them. We would know what we would be defending and fighting for in those trenches and forests. Last time, we had just gotten out of a horrible and divisive civil war. This time, we are among the world's most coherent and stable countries, with no divisive lines in the society to exploit. Any would-be invader would not be able to make us fight one another, but instead would be facing one nation. Last time, our military was an underdeveloped mess of scraped up things. This time, we have a complete multi-branch military exclusively and patiently custom built for the singular purpose of stopping a Russian invasion. Last time, we were a small nation. This time, our reservist-based army is possible to mobilize over 900,000 pre-trained soldiers, and that is without having extended the general conscription to women, who would have even more to lose than men if Russian society were to become the norm in Finland. Last time, we were a poor and underdeveloped society. This time, we are resourceful and have a notable industrial base capable of being converted to serve war economy. Last time, we had a net negative amount of alliances with gentlemen like Chamberlain and Ribbentrop having stabbed us firmly in the back. This time, we are positively and formally aligned with the most powerful military alliance in the planet's history. Last time, the Russians got their asses handed to them. This time, well, ain't gonna be pretty. So it is understandable that Dugin concludes that Finland as a state is highly unstable. Unsurprisingly, despite knowing these contrasts and uphill battles facing any would-be invader, he does not let go of the idea that it should be the Russian that ends up annexing Finland. Finland naturally and historically entered into the geopolitical space of Russia. This was manifested at various stages of history. Just ask Nikolai Bobrikov. He proceeds to claim that Finland is not resisting Russia's impulse of continental expansion or Moscow's centrifugal energy out of its own will, but we are just doing it only because our thalassocratic overlords are pulling the strings behind the curtains and forcing us to do this against our true will. Going from the center to the periphery, impulses of continental expansion are constantly faced with the opposing force pressure. The Atlantic Bloc seeks to limit the centrifugal energy of Moscow, using the separatist tendencies of the marginal peoples or neighboring states based on those coastal zones that are already under the sure control of the thalassocracy. He then begins to set up his trap. At first, it sounds just bitterly seeking to dismiss us as underdeveloped, marginal, and archaic people. But as we shall soon see, this will be used as a stepping stone in a much more diabolic plan. In the north of the western border of Russia, the ethnic division also takes place. Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Germany, Denmark, right up to England, Ireland, Iceland are inhabited by developed peoples of the Indo-European origin, young ethnic groups. And starting from Finland and Karelia and up to Chukotka, the Russian north is inhabited by ethnic groups that are much more ancient and archaic than the population of other European north, Ugrians, archaic Turks, and the Paleo-Asians of the Chutki, Eskimos, etc. Like with all other countries where Moscow's centrifugal energy would be meeting resistance, Dugin does not bother himself with such trivialities as numbers, probabilities, or resource assessments. He simply assumes that things will sort out just fine in the end because Eurasian unification under the rule of the geographical axis of history is fully predestined. Instead, he is more eager to ponder what happens after the unavoidable conquest throughout Finland has been carried out successfully. The endlösung he envisions as a punishment for our transgressions is much worse than mere occupation or annexation. What he is planning for us is downright diabolic, and I doubt many in Finland have even realized just how horrible of a plan Russians are likely to have in store for us. Even the risk of simply getting assimilated into the Ruski Mir would be worth dying and fighting for. But what Dugin is envisioning for Finland is next-level nightmare fuel. And since these crimes and transgressions that Dugin sees Finns have done to Russia have already been done in the past, it would be futile to try and appeal to leniency by proactively rolling over and accepting annexation. This plan would be based on neutering Finland's culture, civilization, and economic capability and marginalizing us permanently into an underdeveloped periphery with minimal development, industry, civilization, or contacts with other cultures. The archaism of people of the north, underdevelopment, lagging behind, primitiveness, etc., is not a minus, but a spiritual plus. Ancient ethnicities are not only not subject to re-education and inclusion in modern civilization, but, on the contrary, need their living conditions to be as close as possible to their traditions. Moreover, concern for these traditions should be partially shifted to the state, which seeks to secure strategic control over these lands. So, Finland's development would be intentionally prevented to afford us the privilege of spiritual plus of material and civilizational minus, and preventing us from ever resisting Russians again. Eventually, Finland would be lumped up with a truly peripheral administrative group which would oversee and guarantee the negative development of Finland's prosperity. The Kola Peninsula, Murmansk, and the Karelia Republic stand out here. Together with Finland, all this makes up a single geographic and geopolitical sector which would most efficiently be integrated into an independent and complete system in which the Murmansk region and the Murmansk itself would have a strategic priority and quality of a military decision center. And the Karelia-Finland space would be endowed with a wide cultural and economic sovereignty. So, at least for me, as a Finn, picturing a scenario where I would need to tell to a younger generation of Finns that once we had a good and free society that was able to provide plenty of opportunities and prosperity for its citizens. Once I had a chance to stand up and try and defend it, but I did not feel like it. So, sorry that now you need to live in this peripheral mafia state dystopia with no hope for a better future. At least according to my moral compass, that would be a fate worse than death. Luckily though, this is not the first time in history when a nation has been faced with this kind of an existential risk from an imperialist would-be invader. Let us now for a moment turn to history for inspiration and ideas on how to deal with this kind of a predicament. With a plan laid out this clearly, all that's left for Russians to do is to simply do Molon and Labe. After all, they are predestined to succeed, are they not? Out of all the countries who were able to escape the USSR and have formed what Dugin calls a sanitary cordon, he is particularly troubled with one of them, Ukraine. And as a reminder, please keep in mind that all the extracts that follow were written in a book that was published in 1997. The rationale and rhetoric used by Russia in the Ukraine war in the 2020s is almost word for word in sync with this book. First, he starts up by spewing the usual dismissive rants about countries of the sanitary cordon not really being countries, but rather artificial abominations and puppets that need to be fixed. Ukraine, as a state, has no geopolitical meaning. It has neither a particular cultural message or universal significance, nor geographical uniqueness, nor ethnic exclusivity. Ukrainian culture and language are peculiar and unique, but they are deprived of any universal significance. These elements are not enough for geopolitical independence. The independent existence of Ukraine, especially within its modern borders, can only make sense as a sanitary cordon, since elements of opposite in their geopolitical orientation will not allow this country to fully join either the Eastern or Western Bloc, i.e., neither to Russia-Eurasia nor to Central Europe. All this dooms Ukraine to a puppet existence and geopolitical service of the thalassocratic strategy of Europe. The appearance of a new geopolitical entity on the lands which moreover seeks to enter the Atlantic Alliance is an absolute anomaly, which could only be led by completely irresponsible, from a geopolitical point of view, steps. But with Ukraine, he proceeds even further than with other countries, arguing that its mere existence is the same thing as directly attacking Russia. And consequently, by attacking Ukraine, Russia is not really the offender, but simply the valiant defender with the moral high ground. The existence of Ukraine within its current borders and with the current status of a sovereign state is identical to delivering a monstrous blow to Russia's geopolitical security, which is tantamount to an invasion of its territory. The continued existence of unitary Ukraine is unacceptable. The Ukrainian factor is the most vulnerable spot in the western zone of Russia. The existence of a sovereign Ukraine is at geopolitical level a declaration of a geopolitical war in Russia. Ukraine, as an independent state with some territorial ambitions, poses a huge danger to the whole of Eurasia, and without solving the Ukrainian problem, it makes no sense to talk about continental geopolitics. The sovereignty of Ukraine is such a negative phenomenon for Russian geopolitics that in principle it can easily provoke an armed conflict. If this kind of a rationale goes unopposed in other countries, there is no reason why Russia could not one by one claim that the countries are attacking it by existing inside their borders, and that Russia is compelled to valiantly protect themselves by attacking and murdering civilians. As corrective action, Dugin proposed that Ukraine should be invaded, reorganized, and dissolved as a nation. He proposes dividing the Ukraine territory into zones and allowing higher autonomies and other concessions to the parts that are least inclined to joining Russia, mostly in the West. He even entertains the idea that the westernmost Catholic parts of Ukraine might be allowed to join Germany instead. But overall, the plan is that Russia annexes Ukraine and permanently destroys it as a nation and as a culture. Ukraine should become a purely administrative sector of the Russian centralist state. Eastern Ukraine, everything that lies east of Dnieper, meridional integration is preferable. In Crimea, there can be no talk of taking into account the geopolitical orientation of the Crimean Tatars, since Turks, in all respect, are a direct geopolitical opponent of Russia. The direct accession of Crimea to Russia will provoke an extremely negative reaction of the little Russian population and will create problems of integration. It is also impossible to leave Crimea to the sovereign Ukraine, since this poses a direct threat to Russia's geopolitical security and creates ethnic tension in Crimea itself. Necessary to give Crimea a special status and ensure maximum autonomy with direct strategic control of Moscow. Central part of Ukraine from Chernigov to Odessa and including Kiev. This authority to Russia is an independent geopolitical reality, culturally related to the eastern Ukraine and certainly included in the Eurasian geopolitical system. Western Ukraine, the entire sector from Bessarabia to Odessa, should be attributed to the central Ukrainian geopolitical space. These areas, which today are actively influencing the general political atmosphere of Ukraine, actively pursuing an anti-Moscow, pro-Western geopolitical line, should be provided with a significant degree of autonomy up to the political one, in order to tear off these subversive territories from the Orthodox and generally pro-Russian pan-Ukrainian space as central to so eastern. And being the good imperialist he is, Dugin's appetite only grows when he fantasizes about territorial gains. In no time at all, he is proposing that once Russia has gotten the invasion engine rolling, they should not stop to the western borders of Ukraine, but instead seeks to push them even further. The strategic border of Russia on these parallels cannot depend on the place of passage of the Ukrainian-Polish, Ukrainian-Hungarian and Ukrainian-Slovak border. This strategic border should lie much to the west, at least at the western tip of Central Europe and at best across the Atlantic. It would be interesting to hear what the pro-Kremlin authorities in Hungary and Slovakia think about these aspirations. Polish response, however, would be unambiguous. Ultimately, Dugin argues that out of all the priorities around the world that are looking to require direct Russian military involvement, it is precisely this Ukrainian problem that needs to be prioritized above all others. The Ukrainian problem is the main and most serious problem facing Moscow. If the problem of the North and the polar trapezoid are connected with the distant future of Russia and Eurasia, if the development of Siberia and the battle for Lenaland are important for the near future, if finally the positional strategy of reorganizing the Asian South is relevant for Russia, the geopolitics of the West and the center of this geopolitics, the Ukrainian question, requires Moscow to respond immediately, since it is a matter of delivering Russia a real strategic strike. We'll be coming back to elaborate what these battles for Lenaland and reorganizing the Asian South would mean in further videos when we review the plans towards the East and South. Before that still, it's important to note that it was precisely in Ukraine where Russia decided to show its true colors by initiating an invasion attack, just as argued in this book, or according to this line of reasoning. Therefore, also the other outlined plans for aggression further, later, and elsewhere should not be taken lightly as empty rhetoric or power fantasies. Dugin acknowledges that active invasion war against Ukraine is not without its problems. Such a conflict as attacking Ukraine may well satisfy the interests of the mondialist lobby if it destabilizes the strategic and geopolitical situation in Russia and more broadly Eurasia, becoming local, protracted and ambiguous. In this case, Russian national interests will not necessarily be fulfilled even if a civil war takes place under patriotic and nationalist slogans. As in the case of Afghanistan, an armed conflict between Russia and neighboring regions will only weaken Russian influence in these states and will undermine the attractiveness of the integration impulse of neighbors to unite with Russia into a single geopolitical Eurasian bloc. Moreover, the similarity of cultural and social type between population of the Russian Federation and the former republics will make this conflict fratricidal and truly civil. In the case of Slavic republics, primarily Ukraine, this will also be an internal national tragedy. Of course, this does not mean that Russia should not act as a defender of Russian and pro-Russian oriented peoples in the near abroad. So, Dugin understands that any invasion war that Russia triggers will undermine the attractiveness of integration impulse that Russia would like to use to lure others into proactively uniting with Russia, no matter how well they try to force-feed the narrative that this is just civil war taking place inside Russia. He also understands that all intra-Eurasian conflicts weaken Eurasia and thus strengthen the arch-enemy USA's relative position, but backs away from the logical conclusion of not starting such wars in the first place. But I have to give credit where credit is due. Even in the 1990s, when this book was published and when the prospect of Finland or Sweden joining NATO was not even a faint political possibility, Dugin foresaw that this kind of an invasion war could push Finland and Sweden into joining NATO, and that this could throw spanners into the cogs of their other invasion plans. Even if Russians manage to win back some part of the original Russian lands from their neighbors, the price for this may be the emergence of new hostile states that will be thrown into the camp of the main opponents of Russia, i.e. mondialists, in which case the new imperial integration needed by Russia will be postponed indefinitely. If you found right so far interesting, make sure to tune to the next section where we'll be covering the specific plans Dugin is envisioning Russia should be carrying out in the southern Eurasia and Africa. We will find parallels to the plans in West Europe and real-life behaviors of other countries. But we will also find an even more sinister plan that is so hideous that even a person like Dugin does not dare to articulate it explicitly, but instead needs to only hint at it indirectly, which is quite the achievement for a person who calls out for genocides and ethnic cleansings left and right, all day, every